pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather. We're so looking forward to hearing a little bit about our heritage here this afternoon, and we pray that you would bless our speakers and just make us mindful of all the wonderful things that we have to be thankful for. We thank you, Father, for the food. We thank you for Madison being here and serving us, and we just pray, Father, your blessings on all who are here today. We thank you most of all for your Son and our Lord Jesus Christ, and the opportunity always to embody service above self. It's in your name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Jim. And it goes on in the flag.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. I would like to introduce Madison to the chairman of the current at the table. You can't hear me? I can't hear me. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Okay. I think we've got a lot of now. Let's see. John disappeared on me. Where did he go? He's over there talking. John, will you do happy bucks while you're standing?
Oh, okay, love to.
Please.
Love to.
Thank you. Jim, and let him introduce our speakers for the day.
Earlier for the meeting, I walked outside and saw these two characters roaming around. And they said they had arrived in sort of a time machine and would like to talk about something that happened about 250 years ago. They called it the Rebellion, or the Great Rebellion. They also, other people called it the American Cause, or the war. Some people call it the Civil War. The British referred to it as a revolt or an insurrection. They didn't call it the Revolutionary War. But anyway, I have put on your table a bio about these two characters, and they're both going to come and talk to you kind of from the perspective of a female and a male as to what they were doing during this time of the Revolutionary War. I'd like to first introduce Sarah Jane Armstrong. She is from Gray Corps. She will speak to you first. And then Richard Morris, who is from Abbeville. So, if y'all can welcome both of these.
Well, I'm happy to be here to talk about Lawrence County today and about the women who were here during the American Revolution. It was not maybe quite what you think it is, because it was very rough. It was not an easy life for these women to have. First of all, they came from Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England, and they came over in a ship, and it took them about 7 weeks to get here. Part of my Simpson family came into Charleston in 1772 on a ship. And when they got to Charleston, the colonial governor, he put them in quarantine on Sullivan Island and waited until all 5 ships got here. And then they walked up to the back country by way of Montgomery. They got to 96, crossed the Saluda, and came over here. And by some magic, they had a piece of paper that told them a plant, and they had to find out which river they were on, and they got their 100 acres or 200 acres of land. And that's when the fun began, because then they had to cut the trees. And what 3 tools do you think they might have used back then to build a log cabin? Most of these log cabins in that time period were built with a broad axe, a foot adze, and a draw knife. 3. No nails, because they paved it together. And then they went out here and looked at, you see the forest over here. They went and cut 50 trees, pulled them to that site. And then they had to shake up the logs, because the log cabins that we had in Burkeville are 13 logs high. So that would require about 50 trees to build a log cabin. And in the meantime, you slept out here in the ground or in the cold or whatever. And that first group that I had my Simpson family, they came up in October, so it was really cold and harsh weather. And they endured that. So after they get the log cabin built, and they get things sort of halfway settled, then the American Revolution is in progress. And they're going to have to decide if they're going to be Tories or Patriots. And it was a hard time in South Carolina. I'll read to you a little bit here from William Moultrie in his memoirs from the American Revolution. He gives a legendary account of the hardships of families fight for liberty and freedom. These were hard times for poor Carolina. The loss of property was of no consideration, while the blood of their citizens was streaming down from every pore. It was generally believed that in the 96th district, that's the district we were living in, 1,400 unhappy widows, orphans, were left to the lonely fate of their unfortunate fathers, brothers, and husbands killed at war. And that was a sad time. Then, after the war, there were more chimneys standing than there were log cabins. And then let the settlers, they had to pull together. And when the man went off to fight, he was gone maybe 3 months to 6 months. Then she had the children in the log cabin, and she had to have the firewood, the water, and food. Also, she had to protect the family from Tories or the environment or the Native Americans or whatever else was running through this log cabin when they left here in the wilderness. There was no place to go buy things. I have up here on the table, they had to make everything that they had. And I have persimmon buttons were one thing, they got persimmon seed and they made the buttons out of that, or they got a deer antler, horn, whatever, cut that, slice that, and then made buttons out of that. I also have some thorns up here where they would pin their apron on with a thorn, because there was no store to go to, and if you didn't have it, you had to make it. And so that was their everyday life. And Monday morning, it was terribly cold, and I just don't know how they survived with that kind of cold weather, because I had cooked at the Joe Adair Center in the log cabin and had the fireplace running full force, and my bucket of water over here has ice in it. And then it's just endless things that they had to do. They were the survivors. They pulled the family together. They kept the family together. And I'll tell you about some of my Lawrence County families. One was John Gray, and he came down from Virginia, the Great Wagon Road, to Lancaster County, and then crossed over and got here. When they came on the other side of the Tiger River, that was the Covenant Nation. And then when they got over on the 96th district, then they had the Cherokee Nation. Greenville County, Lawrence County line was the Cherokee Nation. So if you went above Owens, you were in Cherokee territory. And some people say that if you went, like going toward Augusta, that direction, or Anderson over there, it was not only Cherokee, but you had the Creek Indians there. So it was just a different time of life, of everything going on. And so when I tried to talk to my grandson, he's 6 years old, and I was trying to tell him about transportation. You know, you either walk, or you rode a horse, or you had a wagon. And he just looked at me, and then everything I was telling him, and then it dawned on me, everything that I was telling him had not been invented during the Revolution. So he couldn't relate to a life in the log cabin, even though he's been in the log cabin and he's seen all that stuff. Because when we were sitting in his living room, he couldn't understand that everything he saw had not been invented at that time. And that would be us in the next 10 years. We don't know what AI is going to do with everything that's going on right now. But it was just a different kind of life. Like, so when you got here today, you came in a car and everything was just wonderful. You just went zip, zip, zip. But back in the day, you would have had walk, or you were in a horse, or you had a wagon. The roads were not that plentiful during 250 years ago. And what Lawrence didn't look anything like it looks now. Because it wasn't, the county was named after Henry Lawrence, but the courthouse and all of that 250 years ago, that was not here. So you just have to imagine, like when you look out there, you see the forest, and that's what you had. And you had, what, and they, like I said, food was, I would think, there were no vegetarians back then. You'd be happy to get here and get squirrel or whatever was flying in there, fish. And then it was just like, it was every day was hard work. But we get back to the John Gray part. Anyhow, they got here, they built the log cabin. He decided to fight for the Patriots, and he's off to war. And she, and I have great papers that say she came to the time of her fulfillment. Right, so he came home, she had the baby, and Bloody Bill Cunningham heard about him coming home, so they heard his horses rustling under the trees, and he escapes and he gets back in the woods. And so when Bloody Bill comes to the house, he tells her she can get out with the children, and she has a baby in her arms, which was her grandfather's acolyte. And so she's out standing in the wilderness, and he tells the men that they can steal whatever they want, or they can take it with them, or tear it up. And then he was learned to have that. But one of the things they tell about is she had a mattress that was made out of feathers. Now, can you imagine how long it took somebody to make a mattress with feathers or a pillow? And then what on earth did they put them in? Because they didn't have plastic and they didn't have all this stuff. So whenever he put the mattress and the feathers went flying, that was, just one little added thing for her, confusion. And so they burnt the log cabin, and I wonder what she did and how those children survived, because they lived there and must go there. And that meant most of her friends or her neighbors were tourists. So I don't know who took them. But anyhow, I'm here, and so that's how that happened. The Owens family was up near Owens out in Raven Creek, and they came here about 1757, and he had a log cabin. She had about 6 children by then, and they sent him off to build a log house. But they didn't tell us where, but we have pension records, which are wonderful things to have, and they can tell you little snippets about what happened in their lives. Then another family of mine was the Kellett family, and that's my husband's family as well. So anyhow, Joseph Kellett was on the ancient Indian boundary line, and the cemetery is still there, but of course the blockhouse is no longer there. But we have indents, and these are more like IOUs to the state of South Carolina, gave to the Kellett family, and he furnished rations and forage for 500 men and horses. Now, I don't know what she was doing when all this was, when she was living in the blockhouse with children, and all these people were coming and going during the American Revolution. So that was her life and what they were doing up on right over Raven Creek. And we just put a historical marker up there so people can know where it is, and this Kellett Cemetery is there. But I have pictures down here of those indents that said that he furnished ration and forage for 500 million horses. And so that was his life, and that was her life, living in the blockhouse. And we have, it was just, like I said, a hard time. And they grew the cotton, but that was just step one, when growing the cotton. Then you had to get all the seed out of it, and then this thing right here, you card the cotton, and then you get it in a long little string, and then you put it in the loom, and then you make cloth, and then you cut it out, and then you make clothes. And my Curry family had 16 children. I don't know how they lived. I mean, I don't have kind of that together. And most families back then would have 12 children or more. And So their eating style was not as nice as ours. This thing right here is called a trench board, and that would have been it because they didn't have fine china. They would just remember they were living in a log cabin. Then they would have wooden spoons, and then this fork is made out of wire metal twisted together. And they could not keep things clean, and so this is where the word trench mouth comes from. This is right here. And we'll turn it on that side, and then there's your serve plate, and this side is your food plate. Or you could have both.
And then if you want it wrong,
Then you put the roll in, whatever you wanted, or the dough tray. Diane and I collect dough trays, particularly the ones that are worn out. The bottoms have been worn out and then patched them back together. So but this came from the Armstrong family. They cut that. So that's it. And then this is a neat little thing right here. It makes a lot of noise. When you had a garden, you would, animals, birds, something would be out there. Instead of running out there, you could go on the porch of the house and you could do this. They also carried these in battle, and they could be this high. But just listen. And that would start whatever was going. And like I said, I've seen it stacked up really high. And if you went into battle and you had all that going on, that was so frightening. If you needed candles, then you made your own candles. And sometimes in back country settlement, you had been known to, they didn't do red back then, but that's what they did, so that's what we used. But in May the 2nd, which is on a Saturday, we will have the backcountry settlement open, and we will have reenactors there from the American Revolution, particularly men and the arts and crafts people at that time. And the log cabins will be open, and it will give you a chance to see how life may have been during the American Revolution, how your ancestors may have lived, and what they had and what they didn't have. And so I'd like to invite all of you to come back. Also, the Lawrence County Museum has a wealth of information there, and they just acquired yesterday some military weapons and things, and that will be on display whenever they have the big opening on June 28th. And we actually have a rifle from Maryland in the American Revolution, and we have some pistols and some swords and some other military things that they acquired yesterday. So that will help people understand a little more about it. As I said before, when they got ready to build a log cabin, they had to have an axe. And the axe was not it could be that wide, big. And then we cut the trees down there. Then they had a foot axe to shape it. And that's where you get the hand hew logs and that's something. And then this little draw knife thing here, that made the shingles. So that was the three things they could use. They didn't really have to have a hammer because they had no nails. And they pegged the log cabin together. And so metal was hard to come by. And clothes, everything they used, the deer were plentiful, and they used deer skins or other hides for clothes as well as for like a blanket and things like that, because that cover it right there. That would take, you would have to have a loom, and then you have to have all the wool and cotton and whatever to go through all that process to make that. So people didn't throw away things. And baskets, they didn't have any containers. Like, can you think of your house with no containers, no plastic, no boxes, no anything? So they had to use what was available. I've seen people have hornet nests and put eggs in hornet nests to keep eggs from freezing. So they just they were very creative in everything that they would do. So do you have any questions about that kind of a life? Or just think about it. The other thing is, the soap that they had, the soap was made out of ashes and rendered water. And that was the soap you used to wash your hair, you used to wash the dishes, you used to wash everything. So we have all this fine perfume soap now. Back in the day, we didn't have all that. When I tell teenage girls that, because they wash their hair and they wash that, and they think, they just look at it, and I thought, well, that was the life back then. And they had all kind of sounds and ointments, and they used, I guess by trial and error, to have a seasoned food and how to, medicines and things. They learned from each other's cultures, and they learned from Native American about how to get things you could eat and what things you couldn't eat and what things. I don't think you can find very much. You can do good at home. There's no doctors, no anybody there. No, except they turn on the heat, they turn the heat off. And most times they cook outside and sometimes because it was too hot to cook in the raw meals. But, and you just, you don't have to rush. Because the fire's not going to get any hotter and it's not going to cook any faster. No matter how you're doing, it's going to cook down. And so you just have to learn to adapt and adjust to it. And I can do that. That's part of the ability. After that, I truly not much to live like that and do all that every day. And they have, the bedding would be a problem because, like I said, you would have the mattress, you can have, sometimes they would cut and haul a log in half, and that was the bed, that kept it off the ground. They also bury people in hollow logs in the wall. So it's just, you just have to put everything in reverse and go back to that time. Because what we have now cannot be made. And it's just, but they survived. And they were survivors, and the women kept that family together, and they were all fighting, and they would come home, and she would have, have things fixed up. So you have any questions about living back in 250 years ago? And I'll be happy to show you any of these things later to tell you exactly what all of this is. But thank you for having me, and like I said, I'm proud to be from Lawrence County, half of England, and I've learned a lot.
I'm just a little taller than she is. Hi, my name's Rick Morris, and it says in the program you got a good bio of me. One of the reasons I dress like this is because my ancestor was a revolutionary war. I'm a member of the Sons of the American Revolution. Do I need to go through the one? So my ancestor was a member of the Delaware Regiment, and he fought with Washington up in 1777. He was in Valley Forge. He was in several of the battles that were up in the Northeast. And basically, he ended up coming south. And Charlestown was in danger of being captured by the British. Washington actually sent part of his troops south to help reinforce the Southern Army. And the Southern Army, that troops that he sent south were out of Maryland and Delaware. So my ancestor actually headed south out of northern New Jersey. He's walking to Charlestown. Southern Army, because the Southern Army had been captured in Charleston. A lot of people don't realize this, we actually had 4 armies during the Revolutionary War. We had a Southern Army, a Northern Army, a Central Army, and we also had a Canadian Army. We invaded Canada twice, trying to get Canada to join us, and it didn't happen. But anyway, more about my ancestor. He came down south and ended up being with General Gates at the Battle of Camden, the first Battle of Camden. He was captured and put in prison on Edstone Island. He stayed on Edstone Island from August to about March time frame, where he was exchanged for British prisoners. They put him on boats in North Carolina and sent him on another boat in Virginia, and then told him he could go back to Delaware. So he walked back to Delaware from there. So that's kind of how I got involved in the Revolutionary War. The articles you see here, most of these articles on the table here were issued to the Continental Army as opposed to the militia. Today I'm going to talk about the militia. Kind of the history of the militia in South Carolina. 1751, British Governor James Glenn appoints 2 militia companies to be in the upcountry. Why? Because the Cherokees were getting upset because the Indians were getting, people were coming into the Indian territory, and the Indians were getting well, there were no British troops in South Carolina, none. And so what he did was he formed 2 militia groups up here in the upcountry, basically to defend against the Indians. Now, at the same time, the French were trying to make inroads into this part of the country. They were coming in from New Orleans and some of the other areas trying to get the Indians to side with them to drive the British out. So what the British did was they built a fort. In 1753, they built a fort called Fort Prince George. It was right next to the closest Cherokee village, which was Kiowee, which is basically where Camden's at now, or where Clemson's at now. So they built a fort there, and what the idea was, if you provide a fort, the Indians that stay have a place for refuge in case the French come in with their Indians. And they got the Cherokee to help them with the French and Indian War, which began in 1754. In 1755, Governor Glenn signed a treaty with the Cherokee, basically they call it the Saluda Treaty. If you go down to the town of Saluda, on the side of the wall, it shows them, has a big picture, a mural of the signing of that treaty. They established the boundary about where 96 is at now, a little bit further south of the town. 96 is where the boundary for the Indians was. And so they said, all the white man can settle south, or they can't come north of that boundary. Of course, that didn't work because people coming into the country in that part of the area, maps weren't around. You couldn't go to the SO station and get a map. These people were kind of settling wherever they thought was good ground, but of course they were settling in Indian territory and didn't know it. In 1759, the governor decided that the Indians were getting even more hostile because of all the incursions into their territory, so they built a fort at 96. Now, the other places that was mentioned earlier, different settlements are also building blockhouses because 96 was too far away from where they were living, so they had their own blockhouses for each of their little communities. That was in 1759. Mass migration was coming into this part of the country at that time. The Great Wagon Road, you know about the Great Wagon Road, they built from Philadelphia all the way out to the Allegheny Mountains. Well, all the country up around Pennsylvania and that area of Maryland was occupied. There wasn't any country left. And so they had some people come south and say, hey, we understand South Carolina is opening up a lot of country. We'd like to bring our people from up north down south to settle in some property. And they made an agreement with the governor and extended the Great Wagon Road down the eastern side of the Appalachian Mountains all the way to Augusta. And so that road opened up basically this part of the country, the upper state of South Carolina, where people started coming down, that were coming in from Philadelphia. Now, you still had a large migration coming into Charlestown as well. Because what the British had done was a lot of people were being persecuted, the Huguenots and some of the others over in Europe. The British were looking for settlers. So what they did was they made those settlers, British citizens, gave them 170 acres of land, gave them a free boat ticket to the United States, and sent them here to South Carolina. So all those people were coming and settling. South Carolina legislature actually broke the country up into different areas based on where the people were coming from. You had the Huguenots out in the western area, you had the Scotch Irish in the northern area, you had the Scots in the eastern area. I mean, they basically kept the people of the same language group in those areas in South Carolina, and that's the way they populated those areas. In 1760, we had the Cherokee War. The Cherokee finally had enough, and they started burning all the cabins and attacking everybody that was was in the wrong place and also coming across the border in 96 and some of the other areas. The British responded. They actually sent troops here. There were no troops here before that. The only British person that was here in South Carolina was the governor. He was appointed by the king. So they actually sent troops down to help quell the Indian rebellion. And they fought them. They drove them all the way back across the mountains. And the Indians had set a trap on them, the Cherokees had set a trap on them, and a lot of them got killed. And they basically called that off, called the Indian fight off, and ended up coming back to 96. 96 was the staging area for those guys at that time. But they said, we'll be back. Well, they stocked 96 with a bunch of supplies, and sure enough, the next year, the British forces came back. Now, what made the British force even stronger was the fact that the militia units that had initially been identified were part of that force that went over the mountain with them to fight the Indians. And these guys were all kind of, had an interest in this because all the farms and stuff were up here, and the Indians had been burning all over the farm. Part of the deal is you have to give up land. The Cherokee, they had kind of a loose thing about what land they owned. They really didn't have any settlements south of where Clemson's at right now. All this land down here was used for hunting. They came down here, went hunting in the fall, and then take their stuff back up with it. They didn't like the mosquitoes either, so they lived up next to the mountains. And they didn't have any villages that were down here. But they gave up land, and the new land boundary was the Anderson-Abbeville County line, basically, where that county line is today. That was basically the boundary where the white settlers would be able to settle. Well, that opened up a big area again for people to start coming in. Unfortunately, you don't always get good people. In 1767, they formed their own, basically, police force, and they called them regulators. What the regulators were to do was basically to keep law and order in the upcountry. The problem with the regulators were the guys that formed these little groups. They were the sheriff, they were the judge, they were the jury, and they were the executioners. So too many of them had drugs with other people. They bring up false charges, arrest them, try them, and hang them, and basically take the farms. So the regulators wasn't a good deal. And the legislature down in Charlestown soon realized that and decided they needed to do something about it. So they divided South Carolina into judicial districts. The town of 96, of course, was the seat of government for this whole large area. They said they were going to build a jailhouse, and typical for a government operation, they said they were going to build it in 69, and it was finished in 72. So it went to 3 years to build the jailhouse. It was the first brick building that was built in the upstate. 2-story jailhouse. The jailer lived in the basement. The jail was the second floor. Kept supplies up on the 3rd floor. So we had this nice brick building that was sitting down in 96. 1774, something very significant happens. The first Continental Congress meets up north. South Carolina sends representatives to the first Continental Congress. When they come back from that Congress, they actually elect a committee of 99, kind of like a backdoor government. We're not going to talk to the British anymore. Remember, the only British guy that's here is the governor. Appointed by the British. So a lot of these guys served with the governor from Great Britain, as well as with the South Carolina government. So they had, kind of a two-seated thing going on. They decided they needed to create more military people, so they created companies and regiments and militia. In December, they actually had an election to elect a provincial Congress here in South Carolina in 1775. They had their first meeting. They appointed a council of safety. A lot of the colonies had councils of safety. Those people, what their job was, control the money, control the military. Basically, they were the government. And so these people were kind of doing that. In February, they created 16 militias. Right here, the militia that was here was Little River District. The age to be in the militia was 14 to 40. Mandatory. There was no exceptions. If you were between 14 and 40 and you could walk and carry a gun, you did. You really didn't have a choice. You became part of the militia. So in 1775, the militias were starting to form. By July 1775, they decided that now we need to get some more arms and things. And so there was this fort that the British had built, a place called Fort Charlotte. It was on the Savannah River. By then, the town that they built up next to the Cherokee, they abandoned it, and they built this new fort down at Fort Charlotte right on the Savannah River. And they equipped it, basically put gunpowder and balls and cannons and things down there in case the Cherokee had another uprising. Well, the Congress down in Charlestown told them they need to go get that all those supplies. And so they did. In July of 1775 was the first military action that occurred here in South Carolina against the king. The militia showed up and basically took the fort. No battle. They had about 15 guys that the government paid to basically watch the fort. But they've never sent repairs, and never sent money to keep the fort up, so the fort was in pretty bad shape. The cannons they found, just to give you an example, the cannons they found they couldn't take because the carriages that the cannons went on had all rotted, and nobody ever fixed the carriages. So they basically left the cannons at the fort and took the gunpowder and some of the lead and some of the other things with it. Now, the gentleman that was on the raid with them was a guy by the name of Mason, and the other guy that went with him, militia groups had gone down and basically taken the fort. But one of the militia groups, the guy said, this isn't right. This stuff all belongs to the king. And so what he said was, we're not going to participate anymore. They went home. Well, a lot of the stuff they took to 96. Why? Has a brick building. They store that stuff in the brick building, all that stuff, gunpowder and balls and things like that. But the loyalists, they didn't think that was a good thing. And you're probably wondering, how come you had loyalists and yet patriots in the same area? Well, remember what I talked about. A lot of the people over here were fairly new. They hadn't lived here for a long time. And what had the British done for them? Well, one, the British had saved them from whatever country they came from. Religious persecution, the British had put them on a boat. The British had given them free land. When the Indians had an uprising, who sent troops? The British. People down on the coast, they're complaining about sugar tax. Sugar tax, we don't have sugar. Sugar up here, paper tax? What are you talking about? These folks up here are looking at it, you lost your life. We have no idea what you're complaining about. Of course, the folks down on the coast had a lot more invested because Great Britain was controlling all their commerce. Who they could trade with, who they couldn't trade with. And so they were really upset. The guys up here, they didn't understand what the revolt was about. They couldn't understand why we were going to go against Great Britain because they'd taken care of them for years. Provided them all this different stuff, giving them arms and all kinds of things. And yet there's this uprising going on. Well, the folks down south sent a couple of guys, Chief Justice Drayton and a minister, to come up here and basically try to convince these folks that independence would be a good thing. Couldn't do it. Some of the folks have already made up their minds, of course. The Scots-Irish, independence. Not the way the British are treating them in Ireland and some of the other things that they've gone through with the British as far as their religion and stuff, they're ready for independence. So most of the Scots-Irish are for the independence. Strictly Scots people, though, are still supporting the king. That's what they raised the government born with. That's what they wanted to do. They wanted to support the king, and everybody else was kind of mixed. Anyway, they had a treaty finally with these people because they was trying to keep the peace. In September 1775, they signed the Treaty of 96. The Treaty of 96 was signed by the loyalist representative called Colonel Fletcher and Chief Justice Drayton. The other people, loyalists that worked basically supported Colonel Fletcher, said that it wasn't any good because they'd gotten Colonel Fletcher drunk with wine, and then they brought out the treaty and had him sign it. He didn't know what he was signing. And so his other officers were in the loyalist group. They said, "No, we're not going to abide by this. This is no good. This treaty is no good." Now, what you have to remember is, we got militia groups that are not only patriot militia, but we also have loyalist militia. Everybody's got their own groups now, right? Everybody's starting to draw the lines, who you want to support, kind of thing. The upcountry kind of goes into almost a civil war. The folks down in Charlestown, they're going to continue with what the British were doing. They're trying to keep the Cherokee out of the war. So what they do is they send the Cherokee gunpowder and lead, sending the Indians gunpowder and lead. Because what that would do is for the fall hunting season, just like now, fall hunting season, they get the deer killed. And basically what the Cherokee said, well, if you give us this, we won't attack any of the settlements, we'll just maintain neutrality. Well, the government decided they were going to do the same thing. So they send that stuff north. The loyalists said that they're arming the Indians to come after us. So what did the loyalists do? They went down and intercepted the wagons, took all the gunpowder and lead, and took it back to their towns. Now, that upset the people down south. And Justice Drayton had already told him, he says, these loyalists aren't going to sign, they're not going to be part of the group. So what the folks down south had done was they got contacted another militia group, Colonel Richardson, out of someplace close to Camden, and he said, I want you to go arrest all the loyalist leaders. And that's exactly what he did. He put together an army of about 2,000 guys in November, and it's coming north to basically arrest these loyalist leaders, to put them in jail down in Charleston. And he also had militia guys from North Carolina that participated with that. So now they're starting to get a union with different things. November 8th, like I said, Colonel Richardson in 1775 was directed to go arrest these guys. Meanwhile, the militia groups that were up in this area, Congress told them, you need to go get that gunpowder and lead back. So the militia groups started forming in 96, they're going to go get the gunpowder that they stole from the Indians. And they assembled about 500-600 guys in 96. And as they were getting ready to go after the Loyalists and go get that stuff back, they got word that the Loyalists had heard about them, and they put together a force of about 2,000 guys, and they were coming to meet them. So what did the Patriots do? They built a fort. They built a fort in about 3 hours. A place called 96, a farm across from the town of 96. You're all coming in 2 hours. You built a fort in 2 hours. What they did was they took the rails apart, split rail fence, they took the fence apart, and they stuck the rails between the buildings. That was the fort. That was the fort on the farm there. Well, that was the first. The Loyalists show up and they have a battle, of course. First land battle was fought in the south, was fought there in 96. Lasted 3 days. 19th through the 20th. 19th through the 21st. The interesting thing about that is one person killed on each side. Now, you got to think about this. These guys are all from the upstate, right? These guys all live in the wilderness. Most of them have rifles as opposed to having muskets. Most of them shoot squirrels for lunch, and they only kill one guy on each side. Don't think they're trying very hard, you know what I mean? Why? They're all related. These people have fought the Indians together, you know, they intermarried, they built the cabins together. These people are all neighbors. They've all lived here together for the last 2 or 3 years. The peace kind of thing, now they're just kind of making noise. Anyway, first battle is complete, kind of a draw, and nothing really happens as far as changing anybody's mind. You end up with a civil war in the backcountry. The Loyalists and Patriots basically vying for positions and kind of harassing each other. In February of 1776, they had the Battle of Moore's Creek, which was up in North Carolina. In June of 28, the British invaded Charleston, came into Charleston, and tried to capture it. This is 1776. A lot of people don't realize that the British actually tried to get Charleston twice. The second time they succeeded, the first time they did not. On June 28th. And a lot of the militia guys from up here actually went south to Charleston and not fight the British off. And found out the British was there, they were down south fighting with the troops that were down there. On July 1st, somebody forgot to tell the Cherokee the British didn't land. The Indian agent that the British had sent up north to be with the Cherokee, and convinced the Cherokee, once they landed, they wanted the Cherokee to attack all the settlers up here, and basically put the Patriots into a pension type movement. They would give up a lot faster. The Scots that were up in North Carolina, they're supposed to wait for the British to land as well, but they didn't. And that's what happened in a battle called Moore's Creek. The Scots up in North Carolina basically suppressed, and the Loyalists up in that area were suppressed. The Cherokee attacked on July 1st. They called it the Second Cherokee War. The thing about this war was that a lot of the Indians looked like you and me. They were Loyalists. They painted their faces and were dressed in deer skins and things that tried to fool people that they were Indians. Didn't work. And so what the Patriots did was on May 20th, the Patriots put together a force that came up and basically shut down the Loyalists. The leaders either fled or killed or were put into prison. May 20th, they signed a treaty called DeWitt's Corner. The new boundary now became the northwest corner of South Carolina. All the rest of South Carolina came underneath the colony. They had a couple of years of peace. Everybody kind of settled down, you know, you just kind of tolerated each other. I don't know what your political views are, we just kind of tolerated each other. In December 1778, Savannah was captured by the British that turned their eyes to the south again. May 12, 1780, the British captured Charlestown. 5,000 Patriot troops were captured. The thing about that capture of Charlestown was the Continental troops were actually put on the prison ships. The militia basically had to sign a peace thing saying we're not going to play in the war anymore. They got to go home. They got to go home. But the British changed the rules. About 6 months after they had them all sign all this, the British came out and said you have to pick a side. You can't be neutral. You can't be neutral anymore. You have to pick a side. And so that created a lot of problems, of course. On June 19, 1780, 96 surrendered. 96 didn't even fight. There was no battle. The British showed up and said, here's the keys. See you later. Sign my parole. Guy by the name of Pickens signed the parole. Said, I'll take that. I'm not going to fight it. I'm going to go home and live in peace. And that kind of leads us up to June 19th. Several militia units continued to fight. Sumter, Marion, some of the other common names. These guys continued to fight against the British guerrilla tactics everywhere they went. Some of the victories that the militia was responsible for, Musgrove Mill, Huck's defeat, Kings Mountain, all fought with militia. Kings Mountain was militia from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia. And then, of course, that was just the British side. The only foreigner that was at Kings Mountain was a guy from Scotland, a guy by the name of Ferguson. Everybody else were Americans. They were all Americans fighting America. So, Kings Mountain, and then, of course, you had the Cowpens. Cowpens was a great victory. Guilford Courthouse, kind of a draw. Hawkirk Hill, kind of a draw. Second Battle of Augusta, 96 Siege, Utah Springs, and, of course, Charlestown, Final Battle of Charlestown. Some of the defeats that they've gone through, Savannah, they fought down in Savannah. The militia actually went to Savannah to try to fight. And Buford's Massacre also, we lost that one. And, of course, the first battle came in Augusta. Over 200 engagements were fought here in South Carolina, and most of them were fought with the militia. As she stated, a lot of times they were going, you see all the battles they fought, the militia would just get caught up in it. That was the rule. So, a little bit about the militia in South Carolina. Anybody have any questions? Correct. Correct. Loyalist militia against patriot militia. What they've done is they've actually built an army at 96. Ferguson was tasked by Cornwallis to build an army of loyalists, basically be part of his force that went into North Carolina. And what he did was, he built that force, and he went up to the west side, Cornwallis' flank, and basically was trying to protect it. Those were all Americans, loyalist Americans. Anything else? Thank you so much for having me.
Great, Sarah, thank you so much for coming today. Had a little bit of flashbacks of our third grade field trips when I took my daughter to go to Charleston every year. Each of them were in third grade to learn about South Carolina history. So it's always nice to be taken back. Thank you again, and thank you, Jim, for bringing them today. If you would, are there any other announcements for the club? No? All right, if you would stand and join me in